For those of you who have watched my content and are familiar with a particular style or combination of reading materials, scripts, and notes from which I usually work, I want this video to be a lot more free-flowing. I don't have a script prepared for this. Rather, this is a mental exercise. This is a thought process which I can try and understand and present a coherent view on the British Empire, my thoughts on the British Empire. Indeed, I don't have a definitive view on the British Empire. It's always subject to change. Indeed, when one talks about the history of the British Empire, one is not just talking about the history of the British Isles, or really the history of the world from the 17th century up until the late 20th century. One is talking about the history of the domains in Africa, one is talking about the history of the domains in India, but also fundamentally what was the legacy of the British Empire, what it represented. And here I'm going to try and find various precedents for what the empire was and what it became, really as a history as a process of becoming, trying to understand this particular and peculiar entity known as the British Empire. Though Britain would not exist as a formal political entity until 1707 with the union of the kingdoms of England and Scotland, I would say that the process towards empire had been underway for over a century at this point. But what is meant by empire here? Empire as in an English subjugation of the British Isles, or as an English Celtic amalgamation with colonies in the Americas, or as a collection of dominions, colonies, and protectorates in association with the mother country, or finally a global hegemon formed around maritime and commercial dominance, influencing, if not controlling, the affairs of many nominally sovereign nations. There was never a moment when an English or a British sovereign declared that he was an emperor of England or Britain, though Henry VIII, in his restraint of appeals to Rome, had alluded to it, the idea that Britain, England, was becoming an empire in its own right, separate from the spiritual domain of Rome or the temporal domain of the Holy Roman Emperor. But this is more an assertion of sovereignty, imperium equating to sovereignty, than it is the formal declaration that Britain has become something more, or England has become something more than simply being a nation or a commonwealth, and one has assumed the role of empire. And in the Western context, of course, empire being intimately associated with Rome, and in the case of the 16th century, Holy Rome, whether in the form of the emperor, in the form of the Pope. In the British instance, the title of Empress, for example, awarded to Queen Victoria, was linked to India, and India alone, the British Indian Empire existing within the Greater British Empire. For there was never a moment when the vast territories and dependencies of the British became fully politically and economically integrated with one another, forming common institutions beyond the monarchy, such as an imperial parliament. As a result, the British Empire as an idea encompassed the British Isles, yet was something other, domestic history and imperial history being treated as separate subjects. I would say that as the empire itself had many territories, Britain had many empires. When it comes to the first of such empires, when you're looking for imperial precedents, I would look to say someone like Henry II, albeit looking at Henry II as some sort of precedent for everything that would come later would be, in some senses, misguided. Henry II was a francophone monarch ruling from Anjou, more interested in the possessions of France, albeit his collected domains resembled that of a crown of England. And as far as we have this idea of English subjugation of the British Empire, of the British Isles, England expanding into Britain, Henry II is the one responsible for establishing a definitive English presence in Ireland by way of actually attempting to create a second front for which to attack Wales. This idea of expanding the empire into Britain, of course, will be followed up by Edward I, Edward Longshanks, the Justinian of the Kingdom of England, with his conquest of Wales and his attempted conquest of Scotland. As the empire in France, as the process of the Hundred Years' War went badly for the English, and by the middle of the 16th century, England found itself with no continental possessions at all. All that was left to them was the English Empire within Britain, and this is an obvious state where one can talk about leaving behind the Angevin, Plantagenet, Franco-English wars and all notions of empire, however complicated, that comes from the medieval period, and we can talk about something which is recognisable as the origins of the British Empire. And what is ironic to consider here is that the British Empire was operating merely as a nuisance, an annoyance to the then great empire, the first empire upon which the sun never set, which of course was the Spanish Empire, which in the middle of the 16th century encompassed Mexico, what would later become Colombia, Peru, expanding as far as the Philippines, and when Portugal would also be added to the Spanish Empire in the 1580s, you see the vast maritime network in Africa and India also attached to that personal union of the Spanish monarchy. Compared to that, England, under Elizabeth I, was nothing. But what England did have in abundance, much to the furor of the Spanish, were merchant or aristocratic adventurers, Walter Raleigh, Sir Francis Drake. Indeed, on the one hand, we have these great sailor privateers who are frustrating the progress of Spanish treasure fleets carrying vast supplies of bullion, which are supplying the Spanish war effort, financing the cause of Catholicism against Protestantism and the Dutch revolt, of which England will support the Dutch revolters, the Dutch revolutionaries. So the British Empire emerges in conflict contesting the hegemony of the Spanish Empire. But Britain, England, is not the obvious successor to Spain at all at this point. Rather, we do have certain land parallels with the sailor privateers, the aristocratic adventurers, in the form of the adventurers in Ireland. And then with James I, we see the creation of the Ulster plantationists. So already in Ireland, you can possibly see and in Wales, the beginnings of a pattern of expansion, or you can even say exploitation, which is going to continue beyond the British Isles when you have the creation of Jamestown at the beginning of the reign of James I, and later, of course, the settlers, the Pilgrim Fathers moving into Massachusetts. And what I find fascinating about the colonization of the Americas is that I see the origin of the American War of Independence seeded as a result of the failure of the English Reformation. And what I mean by the failure of the English Reformation, I alluded to earlier this idea that Henry VIII had alluded to the idea of assuming imperial authority, that England was an empire unto itself when he split with Rome. This is because he was assuming the powers of a spiritual leader, the spiritual head of the Church of England, upon which no other authority could exert control or influence over this. This put the English Reformation in an odd position, because on one hand you had the hardline reformers, the apostles of Calvin from Geneva, Calvin and Calvinism, which would affect the dogma of John Knox and later the Scottish Presbyterian movement. And on the other hand, you have the Episcopalian movement, the idea of the church as hierarchical, structured around bishops, and subordinate to the authority of the monarch. In other words, you have a reforming zeal independent of the monarch, and you have the desire of the monarch in England to control the state religion, the Christian religion, which is a unique experiment for England in the 16th century, where there had been this understanding between the spiritual prerogatives of the Pope and the temporal powers of the King of England. What I mean, therefore, by the failure of the English Reformation, on the one hand, Catholicism is never definitively stamped out in the British Isles, the most obvious example being in Ireland. But on the other, the English Reformation fails to become purely a monarchical religion. It fails to stamp out the radicals. So when looking at the creation of the 13 colonies, the American colonies, I can't help but feel struck by the fact that it represents the various extremes disaffected by the progress of the English Reformation. So from East Anglia, you see many of the English Puritans coming over and establishing themselves in Massachusetts. From Delaware to New York, you see the cosmopolitan culture of London, you can say the more centrist Anglicans. In places like Maryland, you see Catholics, and to the south in Virginia, you see many English cavaliers who would be seen as royalists siding with Charles I. And Charles I is another good instance in terms of talking about the failure of the English Reformation, because Charles I had attempted to formalise a royal religion, and the pushback from Parliament was as much a pushback against his personal prerogatives, trying to rule the country without its consent, as it was a pushback against his attempt to create a formal state religion, consolidating the progress made under James I and Elizabeth I, and adopt the religious reform program of Laudinism. This is all to say that the frustrations evident in the three kingdoms, Scotland, of course, of which Charles was also king, England, Ireland, were also being replicated into the New World. So what really did this empire mean? It wasn't really an empire at all. All of these states, whether it was the colonies, whether it was Scotland, Ireland, England, had their own conceptions and identity which were often opposed to that of monarchy. And when one looks at the idea of a British Empire, or an empire in general, say for example the Roman Empire as an instance, one is drawn to the figure of an Augustus, of a Caesar, as indeed one is in the Eastern Roman Empire, or in China, or in Russia with the Tsar. The empire is focused on the figure of the emperor. So the British Empire is created contesting the authority of the supposedly sovereign authority, the man who is combining imperial powers through the office of spiritual leader and temporal leader, that being the King of England. And that is really what I mean by the failure of the Reformation. It is the failure of the Reformation that creates the environment for the expansion, ultimately, of what would later become the British Empire. The British Empire entering into a national sort of consciousness by the beginning of the 18th century. Cromwell here is a particularly interesting figure in terms of marking this definitive transition from Little England as a kingdom into a British Empire, because not only did Cromwell establish a permanent imperial presence in Ireland, Cromwell was really the first man, far more successful than Edward I, to subjugate all three kingdoms of the British Isles. But he also was one of the harbingers for the end of the Spanish Empire. In imitation of the Dutch, who were then the great trading empire looked set to replace the Spanish, he established colonies in the West Indies, Jamaica and Barbados and the Bahamas, and these territories would ultimately become the richest territories of the British Empire for the next century. But at the same time, Cromwell is representative of this failure of the English Reformation to subordinate all religious impulses to the monarch, not to mention the fact that he was responsible for killing Charles I, but moreover, he represents a radical version of Puritanism which is by no means accepted by the broader strokes population of the British Empire, so to speak, within the colonies or within the three kingdoms. But more than that, he's looking to the Dutch Empire with their massive navy, their maritime dominance, their commercial dominance, the inroads they had made into Brazil, taking over the commercial dominance of the Portuguese Empire. And he sees in the Portuguese Empire a empire dominated by not only reform-minded Christians, but also by traders, capitalists, and Jews. And so it is Cromwell that looks at this and attempts to deliberately imitate the Dutch model, and he lifts a ban on Jews entering the country, which had been in place for over 300 years up until this point. So Cromwell is perhaps more conscious than any of his predecessors, especially his monarchical predecessor, Charles I, in attempting to establish something that was imperial beyond simply the Isles, but trying to create England as a second Netherlands and in opposition to the growing power of the Spanish. So Cromwell is an obvious demarcation point in terms of the growing awareness of British power, but also Cromwell is an oddity in many ways because Cromwell establishes a permanent standing army. And when one looks at the future of the British Empire in contrast to the other empires in Europe, especially Spain and France, what distinguishes Britain and England is its maritime dominance, as with the Dutch. It is not an empire which is predicated on fielding vast armies. And so once the new model army is disbanded, once we return to the age where England no longer has a standing army in peacetime, the normality is returned, whereby it once again becomes an empire of commerce, an empire of maritime supremacy, albeit it's hotly being contested with the Dutch. And it's not obvious in the 17th century that Britain is going to wrest, or England is going to wrest this position from the Dutch, because England undergoes a series of humiliations in the Anglo-Dutch Wars throughout the reign of Charles II. As I've mentioned, the failure of the Reformation being key to laying the foundations, the weak foundations of the British Empire, in terms that it lacks a unifying spiritual mission, but it also lacks an imperial figurehead in the king, which is very strange when one compares it to, say, for example, even the contemporary Spanish Empire. The other conflict to consider is that between Toryism and the Whigs. Toryism in the colonies, this is something demonstrated with Charles II and James II and later with George III. There is an attempt to reform the colonies, to integrate them into a broader conception of England or later become a British Empire. This goes very badly in the case of the 17th century and is repudiated when William III is brought in as a result of the Dutch coup of 1688. From 1688 until 1760, you have complete full spectrum Whig dominance, one that is confirmed by Whig victories, the Hanoverian succession against the Jacobites, the Old Pretender being the would-be James III, the son of James II, and Bonnie Prince Charlie. This underlines further this idea that Catholics and more radical elements in the Church of England, the more nonconformist elements of the Church of England, Catholics have been pushed aside, high Tories as representing the strict monarchical relationship, fealty of religion to the king have also been swept aside in favour of the Whigs. And the Whigs are beginning with the office and entrenchment of First Lord of the Treasury, Robert Walpole, etc., are beginning to represent a firm imperial oligarchy in opposition to the nominal headship of a king. The Hanoverians, in this instance, are more concerned with the preservation of their electorate in Germany than they are as lording over some sort of imperial territory stretching from the Caribbean to New England to the Three Kingdoms. And in 1707 we see the consolidation of Scotland and England into the United Kingdom, into Great Britain. And really, you can say that this is off the back of Scotland wanting to opt into the British Empire rather than wanting to opt in to become lorded over by England, because England had set the tempo for successive colonisation, especially after Cromwell, and Scotland had failed with the Darien scheme. So the creation of a British Empire was actually, or rather the existence of a British Empire was a prerequisite for the creation of Great Britain as an entity in 1707. So all of these factors considered, we have by 1760 a empire which is based on commerce, to an extent does not have a single religious foundation, and has a weak monarchical figurehead, but has colonies stretching throughout North America and Britain. But we're also beginning to see Britain's burgeoning maritime dominance. In the Spanish War of Succession, Britain establishes a naval empire in the Western Mediterranean. It seizes Gibraltar and it seizes Minorca. And also at this time, especially with the fusion of the Dutch and the British foreign policies during the reign of William III, England is beginning to eclipse the former great Protestant naval power, which is that of the Netherlands. So for all intents and purposes, it seems that we have the creation of a trading empire based on Anglo-Scottish white settlers who are linked together through this idea of the English liberty. When one looks at the protestations of the American revolutionaries, and this is very evident at the end of the reign of Charles II, there is a unconscious or conscious attempt to standardize the rights of Englishmen within the colonies as in the home country themselves. And therefore you can say if the empire is to have any ideology at all, it is the linking of commerce with this idea of the preservation of the English liberty. We are not an empire like that of the Spanish or the Muscovite Tsardom or any other, because it is an empire founded on weak religious authority, weak monarchical authority, and the prominence of maritime trade and the preservations of liberties. Of course, when the religious settlement and when these liberties are threatened, as we see elsewhere in Europe, in fact, the Dutch Republic is founded on this premise. We see the advent of the monarchomachs, those fighting against the foundation of monarchy. When George III comes along, we see a restoration of a form of Toryism, not the sort of Toryism that existed in 1688, but nevertheless a Toryism which sees an attempt to reassert personal rule over the colonies. But of course, this is all taking place amidst a significant military engagement, being that of the 7 Years' War. In the 7 Years' War, the British are able to seize Canada from the French, thereby establishing a hegemony over North America. But more than that, they are able to, through the intervention of Clive of India at the Battle of Plassey, they're able to establish British dominance over India, or rather dominance of the East India Company, at a time where India was contested by Portugal, France, and the Netherlands, of course, operating out from their base in Ceylon. So from 1757 onwards for the next 50 years, we see a steady encroachment of the company into India, forming a rich web of alliances between the local Maharajas, integrating the British economically into the structures of the Maratha Confederacy and the Mughal Empire. We see a series of wars which are fought against the British, such as the Anglo-Maratha Wars or the British wars against Mysore. But the 7 Years' War is the foundation from which the British can establish a near monopoly of dominance over the Indian prelates and ultimately lay the foundation for the creation of the British Indian Empire. Why is this significant? Well, before 1760, before 1757, while George II was still alive and while the Whigs were still in their ascendancy, with the exception of Britain's role in the transatlantic slave trade, which had begun in earnest at the beginning of the 17th century, and the profits drawn from the colonies in Jamaica and the West Indies, Britain, and of course in what would later become the Southern States of America, the British Empire was fundamentally an empire of whites, and an empire which was united by a common sense of English liberties. But with the conquest of Bengal in particular, which is the great legacy of Clive of India in terms of these aristocratic adventurers going off and seizing vast lands ultimately for king and country, all of a sudden a land which was perhaps even richer than England at that time, with a much larger population, had been integrated into the East India Company. And what this meant is that the dominance of the Anglos, the Anglo-Scottish alliance within the empire, was now being tilted significantly in the favour of the Eastern Empire, this Empire of the Orient. And this is going to set the tempo for the expansion of Britain going forward. We're going to see a vast, sprawling empire of many peoples across Africa and across India, across Malaya, etc., while the white majority areas become something segmented within the empire, beginning with the creation of the dominions. As for America, I don't really want to get too involved in terms of the nuances of the American War of Independence, and indeed there are people I'm in communication with who are far more well versed in that topic to be able to provide a more nuanced perspective than I am. But in terms of the significance for the British Empire, the 13 colonies have been sustained in their loyalty to the English monarchy on the basis of weak central rule, in terms of access to Britain's maritime economy, but also as a protector against the Spanish Empire from Florida and the French Empire from Canada. By 1763, France had been removed as a principal threat, and indeed Britain had formed a web of alliances with the local Native American tribes. And in terms of a broader conception of the English liberty, it seems anathema that not only have you removed the major threat from which we can actually call for your aid, but we are now prioritizing people who are not of English descent, Native Americans, and forming alliance with them, protecting their lands, preventing your colonization. And so within the American psyche, it is pretty obvious that loyalty to the conception of English liberties, soon to be American liberties, and fealty to the crown are soon becoming mutually exclusive. And as George III attempts to redefine that relationship, tries to make the colonies an economically integrated and, you can say, useful aspect of the British Empire to help recuperate the costs incurred as a result of the 7 Years' War, they rebel, and they rebel successfully, and the arguments of the English liberty brought to bear against the king are only reinforced when you see him dispatching German, Hessian, Hanoverian troops to subjugate or re-subjugate the American colonies. And of course, what the American War of Independence does is that it allows for the other powers that had been defeated and humbled by the British in their course for empire, the Spanish Empire and the French Empire in particular, to band together with the American revolutionaries and drive them out of the core 13 colonies. So now England has been dispossessed of its own sort of colonial root in North America. This at a time where Spain still has vast colonial possessions and is undergoing a process of consolidation of those territories under Charles III. And in this case, I'm actually reminded of Tocqueville's assessment of the French Revolution, when he argues that a peculiar facet of the French revolutionaries is that the revolution occurred when the monarchy was at its most benign. When one looks at the figures like Turgot and Necker, there was nothing necessarily cruel about the French monarchy in its final waning days. And it was rather the expectations of a political elite rather than the horrific conduct of the monarchy that had created the conditions for the revolution to occur. Rather, the monarchy, in a way, had almost invalidated itself by trying to appease these sentiments. In the case of the American War of Independence, it is the presence of a colonial elite, but it is also this heightened perspective of the English liberty, despite the relatively benign state of the British monarchy compared to, say, for example, the Spanish monarchy, which I think may account as to why it is the 13 colonies and not the Spanish colonies who tend to revolt first. And indeed, I cannot conceive of the Spanish colonial wars of independence without the American example to lead them there. So with the loss of the 13 colonies, it reinforces this idea that the empire was founded on a fundamental contradiction, that being, of course, the weak religious foundation, the lack of an imperial figurehead, and the dominance of a Whig faction to ensure that that monarchical figurehead would never arise and establish an imperium in the way that you would expect an empire to have. So the continuation of a British Empire among the colonies required essentially the repudiation of an imperial figurehead. But of course, when you're establishing a new empire in East Asia, expanding towards China, the British monarchy becomes the only universally acknowledged institution of the various dependencies, the various fealty towards this particular institution. Otherwise, what really links the British Indian Empire to the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, other than, say, for example, the Colonial Office? So that is one thing to consider. That and the fact that Britain's future is now going to be in the East. It is going to be moved away from the white settler colonies, even though the white settler colonies that remain, Canada in particular, what will become Canada, in the course of the expeditions of Cook, we see the creation of New South Wales and later Australia. And then, of course, we have South Africa, which begins as a Dutch colony, but will later be settled by a significant number of British subjects to the Crown, and we enter the complicated relationship of the colonies within South Africa, the relationship between the Boers and the English. But that is to say, when we arrive at the Napoleonic Wars, we have several more significant developments in terms of the furtherance of the British Empire. The Dutch have been defeated by Napoleon, and the empire is effectively mortgaged to Britain so that Britain can continue to fight for the restoration of the House of Orange. The only part of the Dutch Empire that will be restored to the Netherlands after the defeat of Napoleon will be the Dutch East Indies, which later form the basis of Indonesia. But also, amidst the war against Napoleon, we have the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade. And I have always had very Machiavellian reasons as to why this occurred. In the course of the French Revolution, the French had abolished the slave trade. Napoleon restored it and attempted to put down the revolution in Haiti, and this failed. As far as I can see it, even though there is the obvious reforming zeal of figures like a Wilberforce to effect the end of the practice of slavery, the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade was designed against the French, and it was designed against the Americans, and it was designed to ensure that Britain had a supposedly moral justification to create maritime dominance everywhere. Where this argument of a justification for British power extends into the say for example, deep into the African subcontinent, is when we have the general abolition of slavery during the reign of William IV in the 1830s. And this is going to be a theme extended with Britain advancing into South Sudan, into Uganda, etc. Needless to say that there is definitely a progressive impulse towards the abolition of slavery, but I always believe that these factors are secondary compared to the power dynamics of establishing British full spectrum commercial maritime dominance. And all that the Napoleonic Wars do is serve really to emphasize the fact that Britain has become indispensable to the structure of Europe. Napoleon attempts to destroy Britain economically through his continental system, his great anti-smuggling operation against British trade. And of course, all this does is bring the major powers consistently into coalitions against Napoleon. And the continental system is one of the pretexts that Napoleon uses to attack Russia in 1812, and this of course goes disastrously. Britain continually funds these wars. It is directly involved in the Peninsular War in Spain and in Portugal. And by 1815, France, the major continental power, the only way from which Britain could have been directly challenged after the Battle of Trafalgar, when the might of the Spanish armies and the lesser French fleet was destroyed. So combined to the victory of the British Empire in Europe and them establishing a far more benign system of power relations based on the principle of the balance of powers, which ultimately favoured Britain because Britain had no interest in expanding directly throughout the course of Europe. Within the South American continent, and this is something very important to consider, as with the essence of the British Empire being maritime dominance, because Britain's power was vested in its navy, Britain could exert power and influence without having to hold on to territories directly. The navy could act as a very powerful tool of persuasion in terms of making sure that weaker governments all across the world would be able to see things as Britain would like to see them. And when one sees the Spanish War of Independence, the Spanish-American Wars of Independence, when one sees the creation of an independent La Plata or Chile, Gran Colombia, Peru, Mexico, fundamentally what this allows is for a new set of economic dependent states on Britain, and that could also be said for the creation of the Empire of Brazil as well. When President Monroe proclaims the Monroe Doctrine about non-European power presence or restoration in the colonies, it formalizes the fact that so long as Britain has maritime dominance and can actually regulate the process of the Monroe Doctrine, no other foreign power can actively compete with Britain in the imperial stage. And when other powers do attempt, say for example, to intervene in Mexico like France, they do it under the shadow of Britain, not in direct contest with Britain, which is all the more remarkable. As for looking at this idea of informal empire as well as direct possessions, as for direct possessions, the British are expanding into Singapore, they're expanding into Malaya, they're expanding out into the East China Sea. They're consolidating their control over India. They're beginning to establish more bases in Africa. But as a result of the Opium Wars, they're allowed to establish a significant governing apparatus through what would later become the Imperial Maritime Customs Office to economically control vast areas without the need to directly administer them. This is also the case of territories such as the Ottoman Empire, once great empires like the Qing and the Ottomans that have now become little more than British dependent states. All this time, the British are expanding their influence into fundamental strategic choke points. So having established a imperial presence in the Western Mediterranean, having established themselves at Minorca and having established themselves at Gibraltar, the next base of operations as a result of the Napoleonic Wars is established in Malta. But of course, Napoleon had attempted to cut off British access to India through the conquest of Egypt. And ultimately, the legacy of Napoleon's attempted conquest of Egypt is to hand Egypt back over to the British. The British begin to um, establish an interest in Cyprus. And with the French, they will construct the Suez Canal. And in the 1880s, they will directly occupy Egypt, nominally Egypt being ruled over by a Khedive or a viceroy. But for all intents and purposes, Egypt has been added to the broader Mediterranean Empire. So all this is to say that the confirmation of Britain's maritime empire is being tested, and yet Britain is coming out victorious from these various engagements, in the same way that you can say that various rivals to the British Empire, Britain has already seen off the French, Britain has already seen off the Spanish. The next obvious rival to Britain is Russia. Russia, who can threaten Britain within the Black Sea, threatening their interests in the Mediterranean, in the Far East, threatening their interests in China, and in India, threatening them directly on land through Afghanistan. This is called, I've termed this the Great Game as opposed to the Little Game, which focuses principally on the politics of Central Asia. As Britain was able to defeat the Spanish and Britain was able to defeat the French in the maritime sphere, Britain is able to defeat Russia through its use of proxies. It helps defeat Russia in the Crimean War through its alliance with the Turkish Ottoman Sultanate and with the French. I believe the greatest victory for the British against the Russians was actually the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905, where Britain was essentially able to use an ally to dismantle the nascent growth of a Russian Eastern Empire by proxy without having to directly engage against the Russians. All this is to emphasize again that the essence of the British Empire is underlined by commerce and maritime dominance, and the fact that it will suffer no rivals in this field, even though that we're seeing the growth of Germany and we're seeing the growth of the United States, which is ultimately going to prove an existential threat to the British Empire going on. As the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade had been one of these moral impetuses to establish this dominance in the first place, what is the next moral impulse? Well, it's less a moral impulse than it's a commercial impulse, which is the furtherance of free trade, market exploitation of everywhere on earth. What is all the more remarkable when one considers the repeal of the Corn Laws under the premiership of Sir Robert Peel in the 1840s, is that the Conservative Party, then created, was able to predicate this new imperial mission of maritime commerce, the abolition of the Corn Laws, the abolition of protective tariffs that would ultimately stymie British penetration of trade throughout all the world, by screwing over their own farming base and allowing the importation of cheap wheat from America to completely eclipse that of the local English markets. So one can say that the interests of the domestic empire, the domestic economy, were being traded away for the interests of the empire, even though if you look at the simple analogy of the local English and the little loaf encompassed by protection, or the big loaf of bread encompassed by free trade, that argument is somewhat stymied by an appeal to economic populism as opposed to autarky, which a protective system would endure. And as the British Empire is being challenged by America and by Germany, both of whom are adopting elements of protectionism, Britain is left in this position where it really ought to have adopted a system of protective tariffs and begun a system of economic integration. Of course, this leaves Britain in an awkward position because on the one hand you have the dominions, who are growing further and further apart and being given various charters of autonomy from the motherland herself. And then you see the vast network of non-white colonies which are being carved out as a result of the scramble for Africa. So, what economic and imperial integration would have necessarily entailed may have led to a situation like today, where we'd have seen a multi ethnic, multicultural integration of all of these territories. And indeed, that belief may have stymied any attempt to seriously economically and politically integrate these territories, especially if one is to take the concept of the liberty of Englishmen, which appeals to the English as an ethnicity, and apply it universally, as one applies these moralizing missions such as the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade and the messianic vision towards global free trade, say, for example. So, where does this leave the British Empire by the beginning of the 19th century when it begins to decline? Well, I have always considered that the British Empire throughout the 19th century was able to aggressively and successfully pursue its own interests, all the way from Palmerston up until the Marquis of Salisbury. What I mean by that is that when you look at successive struggles like the Crimean War, the Opium Wars, Britain was able to successfully co-opt other powers such as France and later Japan in the Russo-Japanese War to exert and to help reconfirm Britain's maritime dominance and imperial global hegemony without having to fundamentally redefine what it meant to be British. The fact that Britain had a low tax economy, it did not have conscription, it did not have a large standing army. Going back to this wonderful proverb that the British Army is a projectile simply to be fired by the British Navy. And so long as that remained the status quo, Britain was able to have a distinctive imperial pedigree when compared to the other empires of Europe and its imperial predecessors. Maintaining an empire of this size based on a hamstring budget meant that Britain had to rely on a incredibly complex set of relationships with the local rulers. Say, for example, the setup of the Maharajas in India is one such case, and when these reciprocal relationships failed, such as with the usage of the doctrine of lapse and the Indian Mutiny of 1858, the Crown would have to come in, establish direct authority over the East India Company, and radically redefine what the relationship was in India and organising various things such as Ahmed Said's League of Loyal Mohammedans and trying to create an imperial identity for the British in India which mimics that of the glory of the Mughals. On the one side, you see an attempt to ingratiate themselves with local elites and create local protectorates, often involving local chieftains and rulers in Africa, say, for example. And then you have the resurgence of the aristocratic adventurer, the most obvious example in the 19th century being Cecil Rhodes, expanding white settler colonies from the Cape Colony into Africa, and also trying to subjugate already existing white independent states, such as the Boer republics of Orange and the Transvaal, into the British South Africa, which had yet to be the Union of South Africa. Of course, the penetration of Cecil Rhodes into Africa allows for the creation of Rhodesia and a significant white possession there. But what do figures like Cecil Rhodes ultimately represent? As with Clive of India and as with the privateers of Francis Drake and Walter Raleigh, consistently the aristocratic adventurer is someone who is a client of the British Empire and not someone who is simply acting on behalf of the British Empire. Of course, this is not something unique to the British Empire. One only has to look at Pizarro or Cortes in Spain to see that other empires were indicative of this format. Nevertheless, in Spain, strict monarchical authority quickly followed. Even when you look at great sort of imperial figureheads like Benjamin Disraeli in the 1870s, even his imperial policy was incredibly decentralized, allowing, say, for example, for local heads to lead the British initiatives in Afghanistan and result in the humiliation of the Anglo-Zulu Wars and the First Boer War in the late 1870s, early 1880s. So as we saw that the expansion and preservation of the British Empire relied on the weakness of the imperial principle, so too do we see that there is no obvious centralized form of government which is coming in to create a general imperial government, this time under a centralized parliamentary head. I hesitate to say the word democratic head, even when you look at the imperial reinvigoration that took place under someone like a Disraeli. A Disraeli never became a imperial potentate in the way that all of these territories could integrate successfully politically into the British Empire. Indeed, the man who would try and establish himself as a great imperial potentate, Joseph Chamberlain, the colonial secretary during the latter part of the premiership of Lord Salisbury, failed on the issue of tariff reform and ultimately doomed the Tory party to liberal domination after 1905 onwards. So many attempts by hardline imperialists to reform the nature of the centre with the periphery in the British Empire consistently failed. But despite this is not to say that British foreign policy during the 19th century was haphazard or inconsistent. Parts of it were, but on the whole, when British foreign policy was directed by, say, for example, Lord Salisbury, the British were able to successfully win the scramble for Africa, leaving France with mostly the Sahara, leaving Germany with the jungles of Cameroon, leaving Portugal wanting for the lack of territories connecting them through northern and southern Rhodesia, etc., etc., whilst Britain was able to establish what would essentially later be the pathway from the Cairo to the Cape. The railway system, once German East Africa, was also added to these territories, while Belgium was afforded the territory of the Congo, essentially as a neutral no man's land, splitting these various empires apart. Indeed, when one looks at the extent of the informal empire, one only has to look at, say, for example, the dependence of China on British management and British trade, and Argentina the same way, to see how sprawling and extensive and powerful the British Empire was. Nevertheless, by 1903, 1904, this entire structure of essentially weak central authority, lacking investment in terms of a strong standing force to protect the empire, was demonstrated with the Second Boer War and the fact that it was so difficult for the British to win that war despite ostensibly their full spectrum dominance, and the fact that they were maintaining their maritime dominance even when their economic position was being challenged by Germany, by the United States, and by Russia. So after the Boer War, we see one can say, a revolution in British foreign policy, which is to rely even more on proxies and to try and normalise relations with imperial rivals. France had established a second colonial empire by the beginning of the 20th century, and rather than fight it, as potential flashpoints of Ashoda could have proven that we could have gone to war with France, we instead decided to embark on a policy of entente with the Entente Cordiale in 1904 and 1905. This policy again is extended to Russia, after Russia ceases to become a major imperial threat with the disaster of the Russo-Japanese War. A détente is formed with Russia, splitting, say for example, Iran into spheres of influence, and ensuring that Britain will remain the principal power in China, whilst also confirming the security of the British Indian Empire. What makes this all the more confusing is the fact that the British Empire, assuming a pragmatic course of affairs, suddenly undergoes a urge towards self-destruction and suicide, which has been led by figures such as Winston Churchill and their impulse towards European wars, in particular the First World War. As I have stated, the preservation of the empire, the British Empire, was in a sense predicated on the weakness of the centre, the power of and the autonomy afforded to Britain's representatives abroad, from the Viceroy of India, etc., down to local officials and diplomats, high commissioners on the ground. But this weakness also extended to the lack of any sort of centralising figure within the parliamentary makeup of Britain itself, which meant that when 1940 came along, you instead had figures like Edward Grey, who could not bring about a peace settlement between the Russians and the Austrians during the midst of the July crisis. Britain's position was not clear, and when Britain declared war on Germany, it was using Belgium as a pretext, and my belief has always been that had Britain a stronger imperial figure, like a strong prime minister, a imperial chancellor, or whatever nomenclature you're going to use, or indeed a imperial monarchical figure like a Tsar or a Kaiser in Germany or a Franz Joseph in Austria, someone who was able to conceive of the nature of the empire as it then existed and able to push back against these zealots pushing for war, could have seen that a European war, even if it ended victoriously for Britain, which ultimately it did, would have radically redefined the nature of the British Empire. And indeed, any attempt to extract men, resources from the empire, any attempt to, say, for example, implement conscription into Britain itself, which occurred in 1916, already fundamentally changed the relationship between the British subject and the government of the United Kingdom and the imperial subject in the empire. Because the more that, say, for example, Indian troops were used in the struggle against Germany, which effectively had nothing to do with India, India was in no way threatened by Germany in 1914. All of this does is serve to further the cause of separatist movements and nationalism, which of course in India exploded in the 1920s with the self-governing movement, or rather the self-sustenance movement. All this is to say that World War One, especially when one considers the vast costs incurred as a result of that conflict, Britain had been a maritime empire, but it had also been a commercial empire. So when one looks at the empire in China, the empire in Argentina, the informal empire in extension to the direct empire of the dependencies and the white settler colonies and the possessions in India, Africa, what have you, all this does is mean that Britain's position, which has been predicated on her economic strength and her military strength, has now allowed other rivals to come in and assume that position, such as the United States. And with 1917, we see the removal of a great imperial rival to Britain, that being the Russian Empire, but it has only been replaced in the form of the Soviet Communist Empire, which would later be consolidated under Stalin, whose mission is predicated around anti-colonialism. And as we see in America under Frederick Delano Roosevelt, both the Soviets, and ostensibly from Marx's first principles, and the Americans, again, building around this idea of the foundation of the United States itself, twinged with ideas of self-determination and progressive anti-colonialism, again in America. Existentially, this is an existential threat to the United Kingdom, because both these powers will ultimately eclipse Britain in terms of manpower capacity, economics, but are also fundamentally opposed to the continuance of the British Empire as then existed. So after the experience of World War One, which should have definitively exposed Britain to this idea that she should not get involved in major continental struggles unless she herself was directly threatened, Britain instead gets involved in the Second World War. And the Second World War acts as the death sentence, effectively, for the British Empire, allowing for the division of Europe into the Soviet zone and ultimately into the American zone. Britain flounders on as this halfway power between a regional power and a great power, with delusions of great power status being flamed by figures such as Churchill, even though Churchill is probably more responsible than anyone else for the damnation of the British Empire. One only has to look at the Malayan emergency. We see that conscription was introduced in order to fight the war in the First World War. Well, now national service is being used to hold the empire together, where once the British Empire had been held very informally with a very, very small budget. And again, the whole Victorian mode of finances had always been for retrenchment, 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 strict financial controls for the day-to-day process of government. And indeed, one can say a overall competent series of administrators. By 1948, the government was inundated, suffocated by debt, and with also the creation of the NHS, the entire basis of English government had changed completely to become fundamentally statist, and this is also reflected with the attempt to preserve the British Empire. Rather than allowing the continuation of national service after the war to hold the British Empire together, after the Malayan emergencies we have the Suez Crisis. And what the Suez Crisis does more than anything else is expose the fact that Britain and her imperial position is predicated upon American goodwill, the empire that they invited into Europe as a result of their declaration of war in Germany in 1939. With the Americans failing to acquiesce to British continued presence, influence over the Suez region, over Egypt, and the American desire to pursue decolonization, Arab nationalism, if it would prevent the region going over to the Soviet bloc, Britain effectively ceases to become an independent power, even with the colonial power of France, and even then the power of Israel attached to it. So with the winds of change, and with France and the Algerian War of Independence and the failure to hold on to Indochina when it comes to France, all this does is essentially allow for the conditions of self-determination ostensibly to be brought forward to the colonies. By 1857 we see the grant of self-government to Ghana, and this experiment is then continued throughout the entirety of the British Empire. When the Winds of Change speech is made by Macmillan, it's made in South Africa, and what this does is force the white settler colonies in South Africa and Rhodesia into effectively severing their links with the British Empire. South Africa taking a great initiative to form a republic, and in the case of Rhodesia, attempting to retain a connection between the British monarchy, but ultimately becoming a republic by incidental republic by 1965. Therefore, attempts to maintain a large standing army to preserve the British Empire had failed, because ultimately her position in the world had been superseded by that of America and the Soviet Union. That is not to say that the British Empire's end was predetermined, but it is to say that Britain had no interest in preserving the empire after Suez. Indeed, the British had basically acquiesced to American and Soviet designs on decolonization, when, say, for example, an empire like Portugal under Estado Novo were very much determined to integrate the colonies into a new conception of what it meant to be Portugal. Indeed, in Estado Novo, one could almost see a alternative structure which could have been found for the British Empire had the tariff reforms of Joseph Chamberlain been successful in the early 20th century. As a result of this, the British Empire has a rather, to my mind, confounding legacy in terms of it almost being directly responsible for permitting the succession of two systems which were completely antithetical to it. The American system in the West, America, which of course was founded in opposition to the continuation of British colonial rule, and the Soviet Union, which was predicated on the liberation of colonial subjects and peoples and class warfare. Ultimately, that is Britain's legacy, that being the midwife between systems, the end of the Oriental Empire, And you can say the extent of the consequence of the English liberties is more devolution among the white settler populations to Australia and to Canada. And this would ultimately be extended globally towards the black populations in Africa and India as well. The British system and the American system combining to create a new world system in which Britain has become a complete irrelevance, and Britain has essentially become nothing more than an aircraft carrier for the United States. I'd like to emphasize again that if people are frustrated with this format, that this is again unscripted, and this is my attempt at trying to form an understanding of the British Empire, an evolving understanding, which will hopefully be corroborated by more research. If people do not like the substance of this video, I'm possibly going to go back and put this behind a paywall. However, if people would like it if I elaborated on these themes and developed and researched some of these points, and were able to draw more content out of them, please do let me know in the comments. It would really help. Indeed, as people are very aware, I'm rather fastidious when it comes to the output on this channel, and so doing something far more sort of relaxed and far less intense as this talk has been is something of a struggle for me to put out. But hopefully some of you have found it in some way informative or instructive, and if not, let me know, and I'll be sure not to replicate this format in future. Anyway, thank you everyone for listening.